Hi to everyone. Welcome to my channel land. Thanks for watching. Today I want to share a story from me past that still haunts me. Every time I think about it, my heart aches and I can't help but blame myself. It's an experience I wish I had never gone through. But as we know, life is never easy. This story began many years ago, when I was just 18, living with my family in the beautiful city of London, a place full of charm, but also its own dark corners. I once thought I had everything. My family as well, and both my parents are very successful. Make sure to subscribe to my channel, so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video, because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. My father Thomas is a busy businessman, and my mother Clara is an interior designer with impeccable taste. Despite their busy careers, my parents always made an effort to spend time with me. And my two older brothers Max and James, they are 2 years older than me. And if I had to describe them, I would say they are both incredibly handsome and charming. I've always been proud to have brothers like them as the youngest. I was spoiled by my parents. They never let me want for anything, whether material things or love. But truth be told, I always felt that their love, no matter how strong, didn't compare to the love I received from Max and James. They were not just my brothers, but also my protectors, my companions always there to watch over and care for me. What made me feel that their love was different from my parents is that they always showed their care through gestures and actions. My parents' love was more about providing a comfortable life for me, but Max and James did more. They understood me in ways my parents sometimes couldn't. Whenever I felt down, they could tell. Even if I didn't speak a word, they were always the first ones I turned to when I needed to talk, listening without judgment when I was younger. Whenever he was hurt or picked on at school, it was always Max and James who came to my defense. I remember one time when my classmates teased me for the dress I wore and I came home in tears. Both brothers not only comforted me but also went to the school to set things right. They didn't use violence, but their sharp words and cold demeanor made those bullies never dare to hurt me again. They were heroes, always ready to stand by me whenever I needed them. I remember the evenings when the whole family gathered, but I always preferred to sit between Max and James. They would give me tight hugs, often joking over how would sit next to me. They always teased that I was their little princess, and that it was their duty to protect me. Forever over time, I began to feel that their love was unlike anyone else's in the family they were. Also, the first one Esto helped me through the awkward years of adolescence when I started feeling insecure about my looks. James spent time teaching me how to apply makeup, reminding me that I was beautiful, just the way I was. Max helped me pick out clothes, calling me the cutest little sister in the world. They made me feel special, loved without conditions in my eyes. My brothers weren't just family. They were my emotional anchor when my parents were busy with work. Max and James were the ones who made sure I was never alone. They took me to school, helped me with my homework, and kept me company. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, and I would knock on their doors. They'd always welcome me, telling me funny stories or just sitting with me until I fell asleep. Those small gestures made me believe that their love for me was deeper than what I received from my parents. But that love, the love I thought was pure, became the source of my greatest regret. It's a story that would take more time to explain. I'm not sure if anyone will truly understand, but everything that happened when I was 18 completely changed my life. When I find the courage, I'll share the rest of that memory with you. I remember everything so clearly as the youngest in the family. I often did silly things without fear of punishment. Sometimes I would jump into their laps or sit beside them as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Max and James were not only my brothers, but also my closest friends, the people I felt most comfortable with. One warm summer afternoon, I stepped out of my bedroom, The sunlight streamed through the large window, filling the living room with a gentle, soothing atmosphere. Max and James were sitting on the sofa, engrossed in a TV show. I didn't know what they were watching, but they both seemed completely focused as usual. I walked over, absent-mindedly rubbing my eyes. I didn't say anything but tiptoed closer as I approached. I noticed that neither of them had noticed me yet. I grinned, mischievously jumped onto the sofa and plopped down on both of their laps. In surprise, Max jumped, and James laughed, saying, "Little sister, what are you up to?" Now I just giggled, said nothing, and settled comfortably on their laps, resting my head on Max's shoulder. "What are you two watching so intently?" I asked. But they didn't answer immediately. When I glanced at the TV screen, I realized they were watching a romantic film at that moment. The movie reached its climax, an emotional scene where the characters embraced passionately and then shared a kiss. When Max and James noticed I was staring at the screen, they quickly became uncomfortable. James smiled awkwardly and, covering my eyes, said, "Don't look, Grace, this isn't a movie for kids." I laughed, wiggling out of his grasp. "I'm not a kid anymore. I'm 18. I teased. My voice carried a playful tone, but inside I was genuinely intrigued. Despite his attempts to cover my eyes, I tried to peek through James's fingers, still laughing as I teased them. In that moment, I unconsciously shifted my hand to keep my balance on James's thigh. I don't know if it was intentional, but my hand brushed against something in his pocket. The sensation, hard and warm, immediately made my heart race. I jerked my hand back, panic rising in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to look at James or Max, feeling an overwhelming rush of shame. "I'm sorry," I stammered quickly, getting up and running to my room. I slammed the door behind me and pressed my back against it, my heart pounding. As though I had done something wrong sitting on my bed, I couldn't shake the thought of what had just happened. Was I overthinking it, or had it been an accident? The sensation from James's pocket kept playing in my mind, making my face flush. I wasn't sure what to think, but the shame was overwhelming. I wondered if Max and James would just laugh it off, but I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, not because I had touched something inappropriate, but because I crossed a line without realizing. It was the first time I noticed that the boundary between us, which I had always assumed was unbreakable, was more fragile than I'd thought. Later that evening, after hiding in my room for a while, I decided to go downstairs. I was hungry, and I knew my family was likely waiting for me. But I still felt embarrassed from earlier. Unsure of whether Max and James were thinking about what happened, I told myself that maybe it wasn't as serious as I thought. Maybe they had forgotten. I quietly opened my door and tiptoed down the hallway, trying to avoid making eye contact with them as I neared the living room. I paused to listen. It seemed empty, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I assumed they were in the kitchen or elsewhere. When I entered the living room, I was surprised to find it completely empty. How strange, I thought, and paused by the sofa where I had sat earlier, just as I was trying to figure out what channel was on. I heard voices behind me. James's voice rang out. "What are you doing, Grace?" I jumped in shock, and Max laughed loudly, saying, "You look like a thief," I screamed in surprise, turning around to see them both standing there. The suddenness of their appearance made my heart stop, and we all jumped at the same time. James and Max laughed, while I stood there holding my chest, both startled and amused. "You two scared me half to death," I exclaimed, trying to look mad but unable to hold back my laughter. "What about you look like you're up to something?" Shady Max teased, raising his eyebrows, and James patted my head playfully. "You're not planning one eating something, are you?" I laughed along with them. The awkwardness from earlier seemed to dissolve. I thought to myself, what I touched couldn't have been what I thought it was. Otherwise, Max and James wouldn't be laughing like this. That thought gave me some relief, and I tried to act like nothing had happened. "I was just checking to see if anyone washer," I said, trying to change the subject. "What are you two doing behind me? Were you trying to scare me?" "Max, shrugged, pretending to be serious. Yeah, I just wanted to scare you a little, but I didn't expect you to jump so much. James added with a laugh, who would have thought you'd jump like that? Your face was priceless. We all burst out laughing. The tension finally melted away at that moment. James put his hand on my shoulder and said, "All right, let's go eat. The whole family's waiting for you." I nodded, smiling, and followed them into the kitchen where the entire family had gathered. My parents smiled warmly when they saw me. I sat down at the table, feeling at peace with the warm light surrounding us. During dinner, the conversation was full of laughter. My parents talked about their work, and Max and James occasionally teased me with lighthearted jokes. I joined in, and the earlier feelings of embarrassment seemed to fade away after dinner. I helped my mother clean up the dishes, then went to my room to prepare for bed. As I lay in bed that night, I thought back to the events of the afternoon. Although I was still a bit embarrassed about what had happened, I no longer felt anxious. I smiled to myself, reassuring myself that everything was going to be okay. Max and James were still the best brothers I could ever have, and I fell asleep, peacefully convinced it was all behind me. But it wasn't my room, and theirs were separated by only a thin wall, and even the smallest sounds, whether from a movie or music, could easily pass through one. Morning, I, who was known for sleeping in late, woke up at 7:00 a.m., at an unusually early hour. At first, I thought I'd woken up from a dream I couldn't remember, or maybe the sunlight shining through the curtains had startled me, but as I woke up more fully, I realized there was an odd sound coming from the next room. My room was between Max and James's rooms, and our house had been built in a traditional style, with thin walls, so if someone played music or watched TV loudly, the sounds could easily reach the other rooms I was used to hearing and James chatting or playing games. But this morning the sound was different. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to catch my attention. At first I thought they were just watching an action movie or something similar, but after a few minutes I began to feel something was wrong. The sounds were not like the usual noise from a movie. It was intermittent. Sometimes slow, sometimes quick. My heart started to race, and a thought crossed my mind that made my face go hot. I didn't want to believe it, but as the sound became clearer, I was sure it wasn't music or normal conversation. It was a series of rapid, sensual sounds mixed with heavy breathing. I tried to stop myself from thinking about what I was hearing, but the more I listened, the more certain I became. I could not ignore the fact that Max and James were likely watching something of an adult nature. A wave of embarrassment washed over me, and I wondered why I was awake to hear this. My heart beat so fast, thought it might burst, and my body felt like it was on fire. I raised my hands to cover my face, trying to push the inappropriate thoughts out of my head. This is private, I told myself. But what made it even stranger was hearing these sounds coming from their room. We had always been so close, and I never imagined I would be in a situation like this. I didn't want to hear it anymore, but the sounds seemed caustic to me, growing louder. I sat up in bed, then quietly opened my door. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but the anxiety in my chest made it impossible to stay still any longer. I walked softly down the hall, trying to make as little noise as possible, but as I reached the door to their room, the sound was so clear. It felt like the walls no longer separated us. I stood still outside the door, feeling embarrassed and confused. My heart pounded in my chest, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess. I knew this was likely something that everyone experiences, but hearing it from Max and James's room was different. I didn't know how to react. I bit my lip, uncertain whether I should turn back or continue. Standing there, I pressed my ear against the door, trying to steady my breathing, but the noise seemed to burn away. All rational thoughts. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but the other part was drawn in, unable to pull away from the sounds. Suddenly the door opened, and I stepped back in shock. James stood there, wide-eyed with surprise, like he'd just been caught doing something. Shouldn't I stood frozen, not knowing what to say. We both stared at each other, in silence for what felt like forever. The silence was thick and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. James cleared his throat and tried to break the tension. "Grace, what are you doing standing here?" His voice was shaky, embarrassed, clearly trying to stay calm, but failing to hide it. He scratched the back of his head, not meeting my gaze. James's face was flushed. With embarrassment, I was no better. My heart was racing and my whole body felt hot. I lowered my head, avoiding his eyes, and murmured, I was just passing by." My words were weak, but they were the only ones I could muster in the moment. Just then the sound inside the room stopped, abruptly, and Max walked out from behind. James, his face mirrored James's, expression red and full of awkwardness. He glanced at me, then quickly looked away, unable to look either of us in the eye. We all stood there unsure of what to say. The tension between us was thick and it seemed like no one knew how to break it. I gave a nervous smile, running my hand through my hair in an attempt to hide my discomfort. I was just passing by. I repeated, my voice trembling slightly. "Nothing, I'm leaving." I turned quickly and rushed back to my room, wanting to escape the awkward situation as fast as I could. I could feel their eyes on me as I left, though I didn't look back when I reached my room. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it. Taking a deep breath, my heart was still racing, and I felt like I'd just been caught in something I shouldn't have witnessed. The embarrassment lingered in my chest, and I couldn't stop thinking about the moment. The way. James and Max looked at me, the awkward silence that followed it all, replayed in my mind over and over. It tried to push the negative thoughts away, but the more I tried, the stronger they became. I kept telling myself that this was just an unexpected situation, something no one wanted to happen, but I couldn't help but wonder if it had changed things forever between us. A short while later, there was a knock on my door. My heart sank, and I guessed it wasn't my parents because they usually just came in when they needed me. It could only be Max or James. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves before opening the door. James stood there looking just as embarrassed as before. He avoided my gaze, his hands fidgeting awkwardly. "Grace, I'm really sorry about what happened earlier," he said, his voice soft. "It's not what you think. We were just watching a movie and maybe the timing wasn't right." I stood there for a moment, hesitating. I could see the uncertainty in James's eyes. Then Max stepped into the doorway behind him. He looked just as uncomfortable, his eyes darting between me and James, trying to find the right words. No one said anything for a few moments. The silence was thick again, and I knew we were all trying to figure out how to move past this. I realized that if this awkwardness continued, it would only make things worse, so I decided to break the silence. I smiled awkwardly, trying to act casual, despite the tension. "Come on." "I didn't mean it," I said. "Don't look so tense. I was just passing by, really." Max and James exchanged a glance, as if silently communicating. After a brief pause, James let out a sigh, his smile returning slightly. "Really, Grace? You're okay with this? You're not uncomfortable?" Quickly nodded, trying to reassure them both. "Yeah, I'm fine. Honestly, I think we're all just a little awkward about it." Then, to make things easier, I suggested, "How about the three of us sit down and talk? Maybe it'll help us clear the air bath." Max and James seemed surprised by my offer, but after a moment of hesitation, they both agreed. We went into my room, and I sat down on the bed. I decided to make a joke to ease the tension. I looked at Max and teased, "So, the movie was so good you both forgot about time." Max laughed awkwardly and covered his face with his hands. "Come on. Grace, stop teasing me. It's just that we didn't expect you to hear, really." I raised my eyebrows playfully. "I thought you guys turned it up so I could hear." We both laughed and the awkwardness melted. Away after a while, my curiosity got the best of me, and I glanced at Max and James, wondering if I should say what had crossed my mind. After a brief moment of hesitation, I gathered the courage to speak. "How about we try something like in the movie?" The words came out before I could stop myself. I wasn't sure how they would react, but I felt a surge of curiosity that I couldn't ignore. Max and James looked at me in surprise. "Are you serious?" James asked, his voice full of confusion. I nodded, trying to keep my expression serious. I was just curious. "It wouldn't hurt to try, right?" I said softly, not daring to look at them directly. "Now, Max replied immediately, shaking his head firmly. They both turned away, clearly uncomfortable, but I wasn't ready to give up. I squeezed both of their hands to reassure them and myself. "Just try it once, I want to know what it feels like." After a long silence, James sighed and finally spoke. "Okay, but just this once and we keep it a secret." "No." One can know his voice was low, emphasizing the importance of the boundaries. The room was quiet, except for our breathing. My heart raced as we began each movement, careful, yet full of intensity. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, but it felt like everything in the world had faded away, leaving only us. When it was over, the sunlight streamed through the room, and there was a peaceful silence. We didn't speak, just lay next to each other, breathing evenly. The tension that I had feared was gone, replaced by an even deeper connection. We headed to the kitchen together to prepare lunch, and everything felt unexpectedly natural. Like nothing had happened, but deep down, I knew that the boundary between us had shifted. As we sat down to eat, James smiled at me and asked, "Are you okay?" I nodded, returning the smile. "I'm fine, and I think I love you both even more now." I blushed at my words, but they just held my hand, smiling at me with warmth and affection. "You too," they said. And so we continued our meal, knowing that our relationship had changed. But there was no regret, only a deeper bond, one that would remain unspoken but clear between us from that day on. Everything felt different, but in a subtle way. Our relationship, once pure and simple, had now crossed an invisible line. The intimacy we shared before had evolved into something more complex every time we looked into each other's eyes. There was a new understanding, a deeper connection. That hadn't been there before. We didn't talk about it, but we knew the unspoken bond was there, shifting the dynamics between us in ways couldn't easily explain. But while the change in our relationship was undeniable, deep down, I knew it wasn't right. What we had done, the boundary we had crossed, was wrong. We had given in to youthful curiosity, and while it brought us closer, in some ways it also left a mark on my conscience. I couldn't ignore the fact that we had broken some fundamental rules. Even if it was unintentional, our actions had altered the way I saw the world, and it weighed heavily on me. Sometimes I still feel the anxiety creeping in. When I think back to that moment, the awkwardness hasn't completely disappeared. Whenever I look at Max or James, I can sense the change in the air, an unspoken tension that lingers just beneath the surface. We never talked about what happened again, almost as if it was a silent agreement to forget it and move forward. But the way they treat me now is different. They're more careful, gentler, in their actions, as though they're afraid to hurt me. Even though I know they love me. As for me, I can't help but feel my heart race every time I meet their eyes. There's a mixture of excitement and anxiety, a feeling I've never had before. The curiosity of youth led us down this path, one that was filled with emotions we weren't ready to handle. Our connection is stronger, but it's also more complicated, and I know deep down things will never be the same. Again, looking back, I realize how impulsive and immature I was. Our actions, guided by curiosity and emotion, crossed a line that should never have been crossed. I don't regret it, but I also can't deny the lingering feeling of guilt and confusion. It haunts me, reminding me that curiosity can sometimes lead us down dangerous paths we may not have intended for things to happen the way they did. But they did, and now we're left to deal with the consequences through this experience. I've learned an important lesson: curiosity, while natural, is not always worth satisfying, especially when it threatens the integrity of relationships and the boundaries that protect us. Life's boundaries aren't there to restrict us. They exist to protect us from making decisions We may regret sometimes holding back and staying grounded is the best choice. Soto, anyone reading this, I want to offer a piece of advice. Don't let temporary curiosity lead you into making decisions that could ruin the relationships you hold dear before acting on strong emotions. Stop and think about the long-term consequences. Emotions, especially strong ones, are often fleeting, but the consequences they bring can last a lifetime. Cherish the relationships you have and respect the boundaries that come with them. True love, the kind that lasts, doesn't require impulsive actions to prove its strength. It's built on trust, respect, understanding, and responsibility. That's the most important lesson I've learned. Like nothing had happened, but deep down, I knew that the boundary between us had shifted as we sat down to eat. James smiled at me and asked, "Are you okay?" I nodded, returning the smile. "I'm fine, and I think I love you both even more now." I blushed at my words. But they just held my hand, smiling at me with warmth and affection. "You too," they said. And so we continued our meal, knowing that our relationship had changed. But there was no regret, only a deeper bond, one that would remain unspoken but clear between us from that day on. Everything felt different, but in a subtle way. Our relationship, once pure and simple, had now crossed an invisible line. The intimacy we shared before had evolved into something more complex every time we looked into each other's eyes. There was a new understanding, a deeper connection. That hadn't been there before. We didn't talk about it, but we knew the unspoken bond was there, shifting the dynamics between us in ways couldn't easily explain. But while the change in our relationship was undeniable, deep down, I knew it wasn't right. What we had done, the boundary we had crossed, was wrong. We had given in to youthful curiosity. And while it brought us closer, in some ways it also left a mark on my conscience. I couldn't ignore the fact that we had broken some fundamental rules. Even if it was unintentional, our actions had altered the way I saw the world, and it weighed heavily on me. Sometimes I still feel the anxiety creeping in. When I think back to that moment, the awkwardness hasn't completely disappeared. Whenever I look at Max or James, I can sense the change in the air and unspoken tension that lingers just beneath the surface. We never talked about what happened again, almost as if it was a silent agreement to forget it and move forward. But the way they treat me now is different. They're more careful, gentler, in their actions, as though they're afraid to hurt me. Even though I know they love me as for me, I can't help but feel my heart race. Every time I meet their eyes, there's a mixture of excitement and anxiety, a feeling I've never had before. The curiosity of youth led us down this path, one that was filled with emotions we weren't ready to handle. Our connection is stronger, but it's also more complicated, and I know deep down things will never be the same. Again, looking back, I realize how impulsive and immature I was. Our actions, guided by curiosity and emotion, crossed a line that should never have been crossed. I don't regret it, but I also can't deny the lingering feeling of guilt and confusion. It haunts me, reminding me that curiosity can sometimes lead us down dangerous paths we may not have intended for things to happen the way they did. But they did, and now we're left to deal with the consequences through this experience. I've learned an important lesson: curiosity, while natural, is not always worth satisfying, especially when it threatens the integrity of relationships and the boundaries that protect us. Life's boundaries aren't there to restrict us. They exist to protect us from making decisions we may regret. Sometimes holding back and staying grounded is the best choice. So, anyone reading this, I want to offer a piece of advice. Don't let temporary curiosity lead you into making decisions that could ruin their relationships you hold dear before acting on strong emotions. Stop and think about the long-term consequences. Emotions, especially strong ones, are often fleeting, but the consequences they bring can last a lifetime. Cherish the relationships you have and respect the boundaries that come with them. True love, the kind that lasts, doesn't require impulsive actions to prove its strength. It's built on trust, respect, understanding, and responsibility. That's the most important lesson I've learned.